Ready for your next adventure? KLM Royal Dutch Airlines brings you Real Deal Days, your chance to uncover real adventures and create real memories. Taste the real Amsterdam, explore the real Barcelona, and discover the real Johannesburg, along with many more destinations around the world. Secure your real deal today and seize the moment with KLM Royal Dutch Airlines. Restrictions apply. See terms and conditions at klm.com.
I'm Leon Nafok, and I'm the host of Slow Burn, Watergate. Before I started working on this show, everything I knew about Watergate came from the movie All the President's Men. Do you remember how it ends? Woodward and Bernstein are sitting at their typewriters, clacking away. And then there's this rapid montage of newspaper stories about campaign aides and White House officials getting convicted of crimes, about audio tapes coming out that prove Nixon's involvement in the cover-up. The last story we see is Nixon resigns. It takes a little over a minute in the movie. In real life, it took about 2 years.
5 men were arrested early Saturday while trying to install eavesdropping equipment.
It's known as the Watergate incident.
What was it like to experience those 2 years in real time? What were people thinking and feeling as the break-in at Democratic Party headquarters went from a weird little caper to a constitutional crisis that brought down the president? The downfall of Richard Nixon was stranger, wilder, and more exciting than you can imagine. Over the course of 8 episodes, this show is going to capture what it was like to live through the greatest political scandal of the 20th century. With today's headlines once again full of corruption, collusion, and dirty tricks, it's time for another look at the gate that started it all. Subscribe to Slow Burn now, wherever you get your podcasts.
It's Monday, March 10th, 2025. Welcome back to Hang Up and Listen. We are the sports podcast here at Slate. Back with you again. I'm Alex Kirshner. I'm a contributing writer here at Slate. I also co-host the college football podcast Split Zone Duo. We have a meaty show this week. We will talk about 2 of the 3 men's basketball teams in the North Carolina Research Triangle totally sputtering, while the other heads into March Madness as the favorite. We will also talk about the NHL Trade Deadline. We'll have a great guest as we do that. Right as hockey heads for some big economic changes that are already seemingly causing some ripple effects. As usual, joining me this week is Lindsay Gibbs, the publisher of Power Plays, a newsletter that covers the biggest stories of the day in women's sports. Lindsay, how are you? You were covering a conference tournament over this weekend. Looked fun.
Yeah, I was at the ACC Women's Basketball Tournament, which is in my hometown of Greensboro, so love that. I did get a notification today via the health app on my iPhone that my resting heart rate had increased starting about 6 days ago. So March Madness, I think, is here, and I need my Apple Watch to give me a little bit of a break. You know,
there are so many potential causes of elevated heart rates these days. Who could isolate a single one?
And of course, it is allowed that you may use the term March Madness for women's basketball, whereas if this were 2 or 3 years ago, we would have had to alert the copyright police that you had just used that mark, which the NCAA had previously reserved for the men's tournament.
It's
but
true.
Now, A-OK.
The benevolent benefactors have granted permission.
And, of course, we have Ben Lindbergh with us. Ben is a senior editor for The Ringer. He is co-host of the Effectively Wild podcast covering the wide world of baseball. Ben, how are you? You don't need Tommy John surgery, do you?
Not yet. No, I'm going for an MRI. I'll get a second opinion. I'm good. Some Mondays I wake up and I think, do I have a podcast in me today? And then I think the Draymond Green show with Baron Davis will go on. So must I. So we'll hang up and listen.
Before we get into our business, as always, we want to say thank you to our Slate Plus members for making this show possible. Subscribing is a key way to help us make this show. It's why it exists. It allows you to get the show ad-free, which is a great perk. And you also get bonus segments. And good news, we have one of those live for Slate Plus members right now. And frankly, it's a big one. It's an interview with the sports writer Neil Paine, who you will also hear from later in this episode, about NASCAR's first Cup Series debut of a woman driver in more than 7 years. That was Katherine Legge, who raced on Sunday in Phoenix in a tumultuous first go-around, but it will likely be better going forward. You can hear that episode right now, as long as you are a Slate Plus member. Subscribe by going to Apple Podcasts and clicking Try Free at the top of our show page, or you can visit slate.com/hangupplus to get access wherever you listen. The NCAA men's basketball tournament starts next week, and one of the 3 ACC schools separated by minutes in North Carolina's Research Triangle, will be the favorite to win it all, if you believe betting markets at this point. The other two probably won't be there at all. One definitely won't. Another on the bubble and not looking very good. That team is like it's in kind of a bizarre sort of disarray. The team that's really got it going on, of course, is Duke. They've got one of two contenders for National Player of the Year in freshman superstar Cooper Flagg, who is going to be the number one pick in the NBA shortly. They signed the number one overall freshman recruiting class in 2024. They're doing it again in 2025. And they entered the ACC tournament with a 28-3 record under John Shire, the former player under Mike Krzyzewski, who has basically stuck the dismount 3 years into replacing that legendary coach. Then there is North Carolina, which has had a weird few years. The Tar Heels famously beat Coach K, both in his final game at Cameron Indoor Stadium 2 seasons ago, and then a few weeks after that in a national semifinal, before they blew a lead to Kansas and lost the national title game. It was still a pretty good debut season for program legacy Hubert Davis, who was replacing Roy Williams, leading the Tar Heels. But since then, the Heels have had 2 very mediocre seasons out of 3. And without a surprise run in the ACC tournament, they're very likely to miss the NCAA tournament for the second time in those 3 years, too. Even just 2 years after the highs of sending out Coach K the way that they did. Duke beat him by 13 in Chapel Hill on Saturday, after winning by 17 at Cameron Indoor on February 1st. And also, we can note NC State here, which is the third wheel in the area, but did go ahead last year and make the Final Four as a Cinderella 11 seed. This year, they collapsed to 12-19. They fired their coach, Kevin Keatts. We're sort of doing NC State a favor by including them in this segment, but Lindsay Gibbs, you are a diehard North Carolina fan, a Tar Heel, and I do have to ask, what has gone wrong for UNC? And is Duke just going to reign unchallenged forever?
Thanks, Alex, for the worst possible way to start off my Monday morning. That is just the question that, every UNC fan dreams of tackling first thing. No, listen, first of all, I want to issue a caveat. You all know I'm a big women's basketball fan and girly, and the triangle, women's basketball is really where it's at. All 3 teams look good to host in the NCAA tournament. Duke women just won the ACC championship. I just wanted to assure our listeners that we will have plenty of time to discuss them, and I will be doing plenty of coverage of them in the Power Plays newsletter in the coming weeks. The reason we're talking about the men right now is because they might not be relevant for too long, the UNC men, in this March, because they have one quad 1 win all season. One singular quad 1 win. And the way the ACC tournament is set up, their second one would be in the semifinals against Duke, which is a long shot. They are not set to face any quad 1 teams until that semifinal, where, like I said, it's likely they would face Duke. So it's just not looking good. And look, I think this is a culmination of a lot of things. UNC kind of started to fall behind when a little bit, they famously kind of didn't lean into the one and done era the way a lot of the blue bloods did, notably Duke. And they were able to find success sometimes despite that, because a lot of times we see in March that veteran players and chemistry really does help you in the madness that is a one-off tournament. But they haven't been able to make this transition to the NIL era smoothly at all. I think there's been a lot of ego and pride in the boosters and donors feeling like we have this UNC emblem on our jerseys. UNC is the best men's basketball school, and we're at the top here, and we shouldn't have to pay what others are paying. Players should want to play here. So I think there's been like that. And so the NIL has not been up to snuff with other teams that you would think it would be up to snuff with. And that has really impacted recruiting. It also really hasn't had the infrastructure. It hasn't had anything close to professional infrastructure. It just hired a GM a few weeks ago for the first time. The women's program has had a GM. To just get a GM for your basketball program in 2025 is a pretty bizarre way to go about things. And once again, I think shows hubris.
As you know, I'm not a college basketball expert, and I'm certainly not a UNC scholar here. So my prep for this segment was the research triangle. That was me trying to learn about these three basketball teams. But this month will be an adventure for me, by the way. March Madness definitely going to raise my heart rate prepping for these pods. But this game, Duke versus UNC, it seems like Duke was just playing with its food here, basically, because in the first half, they had a 15-point lead, which they then blew, and they were up by 1 at halftime, and Jon Scheyer was pleased by that. He told the team that it was great, actually, that they had blown that lead and that they were playing a close game for once instead of blowing everyone out by 30 points. So that goes to show that they weren't exactly worried about UNC, nor did they need to be, because they quickly pulled away, and Cooper Flagg actually kind of dissed them in their strategy of not really going after him. He said it would have been smarter for them to try, and he was kind of hamming it up for the crowd. But my question here, and maybe this is kind of related to what you were just saying, Lindsay, and this goes for college sports in general, but where do you think the line is between prioritizing continuity with the program and just going for the best candidate? Because UNC, it seems like it's the Fast and the Furious over there. It's just all about family. It's all about people who've been in the program. And Davis played under Dean Smith, and he was the designated successor. And I guess Duke is, sort of the same deal in the sense that Scheyer played for Duke as well. So maybe this is kind of a case study in it can work and it can also backfire, just having that kind of continuity in someone who's really associated with that program. So I assume it helps just for fundraising and for kind of relationship building. But are there times, and is this one of them, where having someone who's in the fold actually leads to a less stellar candidate?
Yeah, I think that could play a part. Nothing is ever one thing, we won't even hire assistant coaches or staff members, anyone related to the program that doesn't have experience and play time at UNC. And I do think that after a certain point, that gets you to a place where you're not hiring the best candidates. You need to look outside the family sometimes. I get the appeal of keeping it in-house, but at this point, I think changes have to be made. And, we talked about the Bill Belichick hire for UNC football and what a seismic change that was by the UNC athletic department and how that was kind of shifting the very core of how the UNC athletic department had operated. And I think what's interesting is how that's going to end up impacting men's basketball. I can see two minds here. One, that the athletic department as a whole and the donors have become more motivated to spend, right? They've kind of gotten over this hubris a little bit when it comes to football, are willing to commit gobs of money to Belichick and his staff, willing to do things outside the box, such as Hard Knocks. UNC football is going to be featured on Hard Knocks, which is really weird. And maybe that mindset, is applicable to men's basketball as well. It's part of an overall modernization and acceptance of where the college sports landscape is. On the other hand, essentially you're competing for the same dollar, right? Between the men's basketball team and the men's football team. And at a certain point, are you just going to run out of money? And is Belichick going to have more sway than the prestige and history of a basketball program?
Every time you say hubris, I think you're about to say Hubert, and then it throws me for a second. But did we note that he just signed an extension less than 2 weeks ago, a 2-year extension? So we're talking about job security, and is he the right guy? They seem to think so as of late February.
Well, I love mess, Ben, and I noted that he had an announced contract extension on February 25th. But if you read the reporting about this contract extension in The Athletic, quote, according to a copy of the contract, the deal was officially signed in early December, despite being initially agreed to on July 1st, 2024. So we're backing up, and then we're backing up again in terms of both the principal agreement and the actual paid agreement. It does seem like North Carolina struck up this deal thinking they were going to have a better year than they did. And then you would also note that the announcement of the general manager hiring came the same day that they fessed up about the Hubert Davis extension. And I do use the term fessed up because I don't think you would put them on the same day if you weren't trying to calm people who might be concerned about the extension by also saying, but look, a few hours ago, we said we're going to finally hire a GM. These are not the things that athletic directors do if they think that the entire fan base is going to be happy that you've just given a guy a 5th and 6th and 7th and 8th year in a job where he has not been very good. Is that a fair interpretation, Lindsay?
I think so. I also wasn't aware Hubert Davis's contract isn't that expensive when you kind of compare it to all the other men's basketball coaches in the land. So I do think it's interesting. We saw a similar thing over at NC State with the Wolfpack. The poor writers, NC State basketball writers yesterday who were on their way to the ACC championship game to watch the Wolfpack women when the news broke about the Kevin Keatts firing. Busy day for them. You know, it wasn't a complete shock, but you also look at, you know, he got an extension right after this Final Four and ACC championship run last year, which, I mean, it was NC State's first Final Four in 41 years. You think that would buy you a little bit more time. But I think what's similar between that and what we're seeing with Hubert Davis, who still has a job, we must note, is that they both had these magical March runs, but that kind of came out of nowhere a little bit. The UNC team that made it to the national championship game, taking out Duke in that Final Four, which, look, is still one of my favorite, you know, fandom memories of all time. You know, they were an 8 seed that year. They weren't that dominant. And so I see a little bit of consistency as far as like what you're doing in March while we've been slated to say like that matters the most. It doesn't necessarily trump all in the same ways that it used to, right? That scene is a fluke, basically.
Yeah.
Both Davis's run and Keats's run. And it's hard to disagree when you look at the totality of their results.
I think it's a funny thing about college basketball in particular because of the volatility of a one-and-done tournament. You really can't win a college football national championship without being an elite coach. I don't believe it's possible. And I think that pretty much the same thing is true in most sports. Now, you know, Zach Taylor almost won a Super Bowl for the Bengals a few years ago. A baseball team can get hot and you don't know how much a manager matters. Ben, I think you can see, I have heard you talk about this before on Effectively Wow, that we still don't know, you know, exactly how much managers affect baseball teams. Mm-hmm. But in college basketball, for sure, because you can get hot and make a deep run, March Madness success doesn't have to say anything about how good you are, how ideal a fit you are for the job. And I think the industry mostly notices that. I remember a year or two ago, Long Beach State had made the NCAA tournament on the men's side, and they fired their coach literally the week that they were getting ready to go into the NCAA tournament. They had announced it a few weeks earlier, but then they go on and they win their conference tournament. Yeah, this was 1 year ago in March 2024. And they still, a week after announcing the separation, make the NCAA tournament, and people are asking them questions at the press conference like, are you rethinking this? Do you want to bring them back? No, we're not. Because winning a conference tournament, going deep in the NCAA tournament are the kind of things that you can just run into, and it doesn't say much about process or about whether you really have the right guy. And maybe that's tough for us as fans to square because we want to be results focused and winning is what matters. But I think it's inevitable in a sport like college basketball.
And we talk a lot about how there's just a playoff primacy now where how you fare in the playoffs, that determines the entire reputation of your organization and how your season is perceived. And that's a change in some sports as we have doubled down and tripled down and quadrupled down on playoff rounds. And baseball used to be more of a regular season oriented sport. And now it's all about the playoffs, even though it's super random. And so these kind of fluky outcomes determine how people feel about your team and whether you're seen as a success or a failure. in college basketball, I guess that's always been the case to some extent, because it's just so much about the tournament that was sort of a sign of where we were going in the sports world at large. And so you're right. Some kind of fluky outcome that could have gone either way and was sort of a coin flip can get you job security or quickly rip it away.
You know, North Carolina is known as having these long-time coaches, right? Of course, Dean Smith, and then Roy Williams. And so you kind of think of it as a program that doesn't move on quickly. But let's not forget the Matt Doherty era, which was a failure, and they moved on from that pretty quickly. Of course, they had Roy Williams waiting in the wings, which helps. But those were some rough years that I remember very well. And, you know, he was the coach from 2000 to 2003, and the program was able to kind of say, hey, this wasn't the right move. Let's get the guy we really want. So I really like Hubert Davis a lot as a guy, but I think it's clear that it's time for the program to make changes. And listen, Michael Jordan, you can really help here. We need some money, and you've got some.
Yeah, Michael, we do hear you have some money, and I can't imagine anything you'd love to do more with it than help Hubert Davis put together a better North Carolina men's basketball team, because famously, you have no taste for nicer luxury products.
Oh, funny conspiracy theory in like Reddit forums and stuff is that the donors actually don't like Hubert Davis as a coach, so they're withholding NIL money to sabotage him.
This is why I like to talk about big legacy brands in college sports, mired over several years in mediocrity. Almost always, if you peel back the layers of the onion, you get to something messy like that. And I'm just sorry, Lindsay, but I'm thrilled, not for you, but for me, that we get to talk about this with North Carolina.
It's tremendous content.
Coming up next, we welcome Neil Paine to break down the NHL's trade deadline drama.
This podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever think about switching insurance companies to see if you could save some cash? Progressive makes it easy. Just drop in some details about yourself and see if you're eligible to save money when you bundle your home and auto policies. The process only takes minutes, and it could mean hundreds more in your pocket. Visit Progressive.com after this episode to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states.
Stars remain up a man. Another 51 seconds. Duchesne across, shot, score! And it is Mikko Rantanen. A laser on the power play. Rantanen in his Dallas debut has his first goal and points on both Stars tallies.
The NHL trade deadline passed last week, and a few pretty interesting things happened. The NHL doesn't get a lot of NBA-style, this league player movement dramas, but I'd say that it had two in short succession here. Number one, a few weeks back, the Carolina Hurricanes traded for Colorado Avalanche winger Mikko Rantanen, a Finnish sensation who is just 28 and put up 100 points each of the past couple seasons. You might have noticed that in that highlight we just played, Rantanen was scoring a goal not for Carolina, but for the Dallas Stars. He's a free agent after this season, and upon being traded to Carolina, he did not agree to an extension offer there, so the Hurricanes traded him after 13 games and 2 goals to the Dallas Stars, who had pre-agreed to an 8-year, $96 million extension. It's kind of a disaster for the Hurricanes, who gave up more than they ultimately got back for their few weeks of Rantanen. And it's also just embarrassing because the team reportedly put a bigger offer in front of Rantanen than the one he actually signed with Dallas, but he just didn't want to play in Carolina. So instead of using him for a cup run this year with a really good team, Carolina just flipped him again, stung by the idea, I guess, of having a rental. Number 2, the Boston Bruins could not come to a deal with their future Hall of Fame winger Brad Marchand, who is also a free agent to be, despite Marchand, according to Sportsnet, moving in their direction pretty significantly in the last few days of contract negotiations. So Boston, which was the Stanley Cup favorite last year and really this year before falling into mediocrity in the playoff bubble, just moved on from him, sending him to the defending champion Florida Panthers. It's a complete shit show. Fans are furious. It's ugly. Things are just not going well, at least morale-wise, among Boston Bruins fans and seemingly players. Here to discuss all of this with us is Neil Paine, a tremendous sports writer and editor who was a longtime mainstay at FiveThirtyEight, where both Ben and I have experience working with him, writing for him. Neil has an interesting new column out at his Substack at neilpaine.substack.com. That's neilpaine.substack.com about the NHL trade deadline kind of roaring back of late and becoming a major event in the way that it was in some of our childhoods. Neil, I want to start by asking you, who messed up worse? Was it Carolina with their game of Rantanen musical chairs, or Boston with its seeming flubbing, at least from a PR perspective, of the Marchand situation?
Well, I think you probably have to say Carolina, just because they had made what was really, if you think about the trade deadline season starting in the NHL around like New Year's, New Year's is always significant in the NHL because of the Winter Classic, and it just sort of marks maybe the mid-season push toward the stretch run as you look ahead and you start to really focus on the trades that you might make at the deadline. They had made the biggest splash, and it was an early splash to be able to bring in a guy like Rantanen, who had been on a lot of teams' radars for a long time. He was part of that cup-winning team with Colorado a few years ago, and like you guys mentioned, was really one of the elite offensive talents in the league. They reeled in the big fish, it seemed like, and all that was really left was getting him to do the extension, making him a long-term part, which is why Colorado was willing to part with him, by the way. They gave up a guy named Martin Necas, who was one of their best players, Carolina did, to get him. So it seemed kind of obvious that they would be able to make the extension work. And so then for them not to be able to do that and then turn around and resell him at the deadline, which, by the way, Rantanen is going to be probably by far the best player in NHL history in a single season to play for 3 different teams if you look at his production in that year. So that gives you a sense of how rare it is for this to happen. And then also just sort of what slipped through the cracks for Carolina with this. And they sort of talked about it afterward. And it was one of those things where they took a chance and they tried to keep the big fish once they got him in the boat, to extend the metaphor. And it didn't work out. And so on the one hand, maybe you could commend them for not falling prey to the sunk cost fallacy of just being like, well, we have to, keep this guy. Like, we already made this trade. If we make another trade, it's going to be embarrassing. We're going to have egg on our face. We're probably not going to be able to get anywhere near the type of return that mirrored like Necas. So we're going to come out looking bad and come out negative on the other side. So on the one hand, it's like, well, you didn't fall prey to a fallacy, and you ended up getting something out of it with the presumption that he would have walked at the end of the season. But then at the same time, you do give that up, and Dallas becomes this behemoth at a time in which, and I wrote about this on the Substack right after they came back from the Four Nations break, of how Carolina and Dallas they're kind of mirror images of each other in the West and the East, where both of these teams have been good for a long time. But aside from Dallas going to the final in 2020 in the bubble, which was kind of a fluke run, very different composition of the team than they have right now, both of these teams have been underachievers in the playoffs, and they're 2 of the teams that have the most playoff wins in any 6-year period without winning the Stanley Cup in the history of the NHL. And so both of them are in kind of similar situations where it's like, you guys got to get it done. It's way past time to do this. And so to see Dallas come out ahead in the shuffle from that, and then Carolina be the one that has to kind of walk it back and be like, okay, well, we got some guys, we tried, we took a shot, it didn't work out, is kind of makes it even more difficult for a team like Carolina.
What a fun podcast this is for me this morning. North Carolina native. We start off by talking about the men's basketball team.
Oh boy!
Now we're just getting egg on the face with the Hurricanes. I do have to say I was at the Lenovo Center on Friday night for the PWHL takeover game, and so it was on. I think it was the same day as the trade deadline, and I look up. I'd been getting notifications all day, but I'd been at the ACC tournament and then driving to Raleigh. And so I knew there was a lot happening, and I was eating my media meal and look up on the screen, and it was clear there was a Carolina Hurricanes reporter talking, and he was just doing a complete face palm, like a literal face palm. And I was like, oh, okay, so
Never
that's
good.
the day we're having.
Yeah, I was going to say that too. Just tough look for your state so far on this episode. Maybe it'll look up from here. But I do hope that the Stars' huge haul here eased the sting of losing Luka for any Mavs/Stars fans out there. I mean, it definitely didn't, to be clear. But still, one team that plays at American Airlines Center trades away the best player dealt at the deadline. Another team that plays at American Airlines Center trades for the best player at the deadline. It's like having a arrivals and departure terminal in the same place. It evens out if you don't really think about it. But I concur with Neil that the bigger loss was Carolina here, because the Bruins have fallen out of playoff position, which is not good, but makes the way that they handled this, I think, a little more understandable. And just in light of Marchand's age and injuries, I think you have to give the bigger L to Carolina. It's just, I had in my notes that stat that you cited, Neil, about Rantanen having the best season of anyone who's going to play for 3 or more teams, because you are probably my most credited source for facts and figures on the show. So it's great to have you here in person, where instead of citing something that you wrote, you just actually say it out loud on the podcast. It's perfect.
Real-time citations. Isn't that great? And Marchand, we should also say that he's kind of fallen off a little bit in recent years. And some of that is, like you mentioned, the injuries and just the age, the style of play that he has. He's 36. He's been playing this kind of gritty, frankly, pain in the ass. That's his kind of trademark style of play for a long time in Boston, 15 years at that point. And so it's one of those like more symbolic losses in some ways. Not that he's been bad or anything, but he's definitely not who he was even just a few years ago. So the symbolism of it to that fan base, especially since he is, I believe, the last remaining tie back to that 2011 championship team, which they've kind of been chasing that team in some ways ever since. They've come close, like 2019 against the Blues, went to a game 7. They had the huge expectations with that kind of out of nowhere historic season a few years ago that ended up not actually going anywhere. So I do think that is like, there's 2 categories of players that you trade away. Players that mean something to the franchise, but it's for the best for the franchise in the long term to move on from them. And then ones where it's just like, this player really could still do something for us. And the Luka comparison, I mean, it was unavoidable with Dallas, how, one star comes in and one goes away. But I'm glad that Dallas at least got something to cheer about, those fans.
Yeah. It seems like it was more of or less of a loss than a lost opportunity for Carolina, because ultimately they did get a good young forward. They get 4 draft picks back in the second deal, but they kind of took all the time to make the second trade and thus weren't really able to upgrade their roster, on top of just the embarrassment of someone not wanting to stay with you after you went all in and banked on that. Usually you make a mid-season trade like that that's kind of contingent on an extension. You work out the extension as that deal gets done, as Dallas did here with Rantanen. So the sequence is off here. And then, trading your leading scorer, Necas, for Rantanen, and then Necas plays better for the Avs than Rantanen did for Carolina. So you didn't even really get a good couple of weeks out of him. So that's bad. Although, Neil, there were 3 other double flip trades at this deadline. This was not an isolated occurrence, because the Penguins, the Flyers, there were a few other deals where teams traded for someone and then traded them away. So I don't know whether that means anything. Is that indicative of anything?
I think it's just part of the overall activity. First of all, I saw something where this was, I think, the 3rd most players dealt at a deadline, depending on how you define the window of the deadline. And that goes back to something that I think you guys referenced at the top of the segment of, I had looked at whether impact players were more on the move recently than in previous years. And there was a little bit of a lull, maybe like right around heading into 2020 and then coming out of it, which not coincidentally was a time in which the league was financially very uncertain about how they would handle the after effects of COVID, not having fans for gate receipts at the arenas. The NHL is famously a league that's much more dependent on ticket sales than media deals in terms of their revenues. And so that, I think, cooled off just all of the various different player movement and transactions and everything. And so now we had this news maybe about a month ago, it was around the Four Nations, where they talked about the salary cap rising. It had been flat for a number of years because of the same financial considerations. Now it's rising up. And I think the floodgates are a little bit open, where teams, we saw a lot more aggression of teams kind of going for it, a lot more weirdness, like you just mentioned, the idea of like, well, let's take a flyer on a guy and then let's see if we can maybe boost his stock a little bit and then flip him. It's like flipping houses or something, where, you know, you don't really have any intention to even keep the player. So it's been fascinating to see that chess match work out. And so in that context, what Eric Tulsky, he's the GM of Carolina, also a 538 alum, by the way. Should shout him out that way. A lot of that in this episode, I'm sure. But I think part of the overall kind of like card counter mentality that he has, and that a lot of these GMs have, where they're sort of thinking in probabilistic terms and thinking about like, okay, how do we get positive expected value out of these deals, rather than the old kind of like horse trader type of ideas that GMs always traditionally had in the NHL. And maybe that's a sign that the NHL is becoming more in line with baseball and some of the other sports, basketball, that have a lot more analytical mindset in terms of team building, and also transactions in particular, trying to kind of work out the math of all the different possibilities.
Neil, one more thing on Carolina that I'm curious about. This is the second year in a row where they traded for a big name at the deadline and then could not extend him. Last year it was Jake Gensel coming over from the Penguins. He's with the Tampa Bay Lightning now. This year, Rantanen. I guess two thoughts about this and a question. It's kind of weird not to just play it out with Rantanen anyway. You know, contending teams rent players for 2 or 3 months all the time. This is a thing that happens in hockey and that lots of Stanley Cup winners have done and felt pretty good about it, because the banner hangs in the arena forever if you win. But also, it does seem like there might be something underlying with Carolina. I saw that just a couple of weeks ago, The Athletic polled NHL agents and asked them who is the worst owner in the league. And the runaway winner, or I guess loser, was Tom Dundon, who owns the Hurricanes. There's been some talk around the NHL podcast sphere that it's just hard to get people to sign contracts in Carolina. Something rotten in Raleigh here for these guys?
Yeah, there could be. I mean, oftentimes when you see that, where there's smoke, there's fire. He won that because, we should say, the Phoenix Coyotes are currently on hiatus from the league. They, I think, probably would have won it in previous years. But yeah, I think there is something to that. Carolina in general, you know, not a traditional hockey market. We've seen those types of markets succeed. Of course, Florida is the defending Stanley Cup champion, but traditionally those markets, I think, have had a little bit more difficulty drawing, a little more difficulty, keeping talent and all of that as well. And then you add whatever kind of toxic situation is going on in the background with ownership and sort of, through the different ways of the front office kind of handles these negotiations, or however they do it. And it is weird. And on top of that, this is a team that they, to your point about keeping Rantanen and just playing it out, they are definitely otherwise in win now mode. Like, they've been in that mode for a while, and they're kind of at the, maybe not at the end of their window. They have some guys that are younger, like a Seth Jarvis or someone like that. But a lot of their guys are in their prime or past their prime, and they're the 24th youngest team. So I guess that makes them the 9th oldest team in the league, according to Hockey Reference. And that is a juxtaposition with Dallas as well, because if you look at Dallas, they are the ninth youngest team. So it's another one where you have two teams superficially sort of in the same place in the contending cycle, but they then give up this kind of prize trade deadline acquisition type player to a team that probably has more runway in the future to contend for the Stanley Cup as well. So Dallas is going to be a problem for both them and everybody else in the league for a long time. And that's another thing to feel bad about. Sorry, Lindsay.
Yeah, thanks. Just do want to note that Carolina Hurricanes have had 100 consecutive sellouts. They just reached that milestone. So there is a lot of support here for the team. There's a lot of community building. And, a little look in the Reddit, Canes Reddit shows that we're, taking this standing up. There's a local restaurant that has on its showboard now out front, Mikko puts ketchup on barbecue, which is a huge insult in these parts. And former Governor Roy Cooper on social media said, "Bad turnover, Mikko. You would have loved it here, but didn't give NC a chance." On the bright side, if the Hurricanes were getting for the playoffs what they got these last 13 games, then it's for the best. So
I think that's a sign the NHL has arrived, right? This is like the rare case of hockey breaking through to have like a politician insulting a player for leaving. Usually that's like an NBA thing.
Totally. I mean, like I said, I think people outside, and I didn't really even know until I came back here. I had been living in DC and New York for a while. And when I came back here and saw how ingrained the Canes had become in North Carolina, I was really impressed. So there is some good there. I would just like to end on that note.
One last question for you, Neil. You mentioned that the NHL trade deadline seems to be bouncing back, and the activity at this deadline, it almost reminds me of when we talked about WNBA free agency and how active that was, just against the backdrop of a time of upheaval for the league and the CBA expiring, and that maybe inspiring some of these moves. But in general, not to steal Tyler Cowen's bit, but if we were playing overrated, underrated with trade deadlines, would you say that trade deadlines are overrated? Because you've done so much research about the impact of deadline moves, and we can all list examples where deadline deals did make a difference. We just did a segment on two teams that have been revitalized by midseason trade. So yeah, you somehow steal Luka Doncic, that could turn your season or your franchise around. But in general, the ratio of hype to impact seems pretty high.
Yeah, and I think it varies by sport. Certainly, Luka was an outlier even by NBA standards. But if you add an impact player in basketball, that player obviously has a lot more ability to affect the team than in other sports. But in hockey, when I looked at this last year, I just looked at what was a better predictor of your performance over the rest of the regular season and then also in the playoffs. So sort of separately looked at it, how good you were on deadline day in terms of your ELO rating on that day, or how much talent you added at the deadline. And when I looked at that, I found that historically, how good you were on deadline day was like 16 times as important as what you did at the deadline, which gives you just a little sense that there's not a huge correlation between pickups at the deadline and how you do over the rest of the season. But I also did find that since the salary cap era, so that's since 2006, it was only 7.4 times as important, your form going into the deadline. And so I took that to mean that it does make a difference. In general, since the salary cap, we've seen teams just be more, there's more parity between teams. You don't have super teams like, the Avalanche and some of these teams from pre-lockout that were just like insane. It was like, 7 Hall of Famers on one team. You don't see that as much anymore. And so it makes sense that if you add one premium player to that mix, it would be more important, just relatively speaking. And then I think it also speaks to, like we've been talking about, the financial considerations, which used to be like just basically a little like baseball, but they didn't even have a luxury tax or anything. It was really just more like, how much cash does my owner have on hand, and did he approve this transaction? Whereas now it's like, you really have to squeeze every little bit out of the salary cap. And we've seen teams like Vegas, strategically put guys on injured reserve, whatever. Tampa did this as well with Nikita Kucherov a few years ago. Just any little thing that you can do to try to circumvent the cap, maximize your talent under the cap. So I think that's also part of it, is that we're seeing teams get creative around that. And maybe the new strategy is hey, we only have to pay this guy, or he counts toward our salary cap for like a few weeks, and then we see what we get out of him, and then we flip him for more than we paid, or in Carolina's case, maybe less than we paid, but still we took the chance at it.
Yeah, that should make Hurricanes fans feel better.
Neil, thanks so much for being with us. And I want to put this to you as we sort of remember together FiveThirtyEight, the website that you spent so many years at, that Ben and I both had stints at to varying degrees, and that unfortunately is leaving the media landscape as of this past week, as Disney and ABC, a couple years after killing the site's sports coverage, have also decided to simply stop the site altogether. To set you up for that, I will note that Mikko Rantanen is 5th on the all-time NHL goal-scoring list among Finnish players, with 291 as we record this, despite having played in fewer games, 634 of them, than anyone else in the top 10 on that Finnish goal-scoring list. And in the past few years, he has jumped ahead of one Esa Tikkanen, who now sits at number 9. Tikkanen was a brilliant two-way left winger who won 5 Stanley Cups with the Wayne Gretzky-led Edmonton Oilers, and received votes in 5 different years for the Selke Trophy, which is awarded to the best defensive forward in the NHL. In 1995, Tikkanen had his highest finish ever in that awards race for the Selke, getting second place by a vote of 50-46 behind the winner. Ben, any idea who finished ahead of Esa Tikkanen in the 1995 Selke race?
Was it Teemu Selanne? I don't know.
Wrong. It was Ron Francis for the second week in a row. He is our
trivia from last week.
He is our trivia
I thought you were
answer. Yep.
Double up on Finns. You said highest finish, and I was wondering if that was a pun, but no, apparently not.
No, I saw an opportunity to have Ron Francis be our trivia answer for the second week in a row, and I couldn't pass it up.
Trying to figure out where you're going with it, I thought maybe there would be a tie back to FiveThirtyEight. So I wanted to note that Keith Tkachuk had exactly 538 goals in his career. But yes, we would like to gather here to pour one out for the now late FiveThirtyEight. That is the site named after the number of electoral college votes, and was founded by Nate Silver as his own blog. Then it went to the New York Times. Then it went to ESPN. That's when I joined on. That's, I think, when you were part of it as well, Ben. And then it went to ABC. That's when you were part of it, Alex. And I left there 2 years ago. We're actually probably coming up within about a month of when that happened, along with pretty much the whole editorial staff. Certainly the sports coverage and various other things got jettisoned, but they kept the politics and went through the 2024 election under quasi-new leadership, but still some people that I had known from there that I'm very fond of. And unfortunately, like you said, last week was the end for all of it. And certainly it's one of those things, and I think as people who have been in the media for a long time, like all of us, you hesitate to get too attached to these things that are owned by corporations, and they exchange hands, and you don't really have any control over the destiny of these things. You are part of them, and then you pass through them, and then you leave them. And many of us have kind of passed through and left a bunch of different things. But there was something different about FiveThirtyEight, just in the sense of what it represented. And Nate, he wrote a introductory post on the first day that we launched that was this manifesto of sorts about this data journalism, kind of a new idea, which sounds silly now because it's just the idea of applying some kind of statistical facts, some thinking along those lines, some data analysis to reporting. But at the time, I think that says a lot about the landscape back then, that this was considered novel. It was considered threatening in a lot of circles, the idea that you would actually bring data, charts, visualizations, maybe some like proof of claim that you were making. And I think in some ways, if you go back and you look at that article that Nate wrote, it does come off as a little grandiose, I'll say, and sort of, making like we were kind of inventing something that already was in the midst of happening, at least. But I do think there's a lot there that is sort of like a guidebook and a how-to, and certainly was a touchstone for us as we went through building this thing kind of from scratch, and just thinking of how we wanted to be ambassadors for this idea that a lot of people were looking to maybe not buy into at first. And I have to credit our copy desk. They were the people that held us to those standards. Every story that we wrote, I wrote about 2,000 stories for the site. Not who was counting, who was keeping track.
It's 5:38. You got to count.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. And every single one of them, we went through what I think is probably one of the most rigorous fact checking and copy editing processes in the business, certainly at that time. And I can't imagine it's gotten better in other places since then. And I just think that was sort of us sticking to the original premise and the promise of data journalism. And I was always just so proud of the work that we did, not just in sports, but overall. And what I think the legacy, and there's been a lot of talk about legacy of 538, but I'd like to think the legacy of it is that you just see the fingerprints of that movement toward data journalism and a lot of the style that we even brought in with our charts and graphics, a lot of different places now. And you see that there are certainly people that have been alumni working other places. And we also see that people that didn't even, they were like high schoolers. Like I hear from people that were young people when we first came out telling me that they were inspired by the site. They're inspired to get into journalism or just into data analysis and making charts and graphics through seeing what we did on the site. And so I think that's hopefully the legacy of 538 is that type of journalism will never really die. In fact, it just has now, I think we can drop the data from it and just recognize that it is just journalism. Like that's the standard of practice in the industry now, is to be able to back up what you're actually claiming with data, with facts, and do some visualizations as well as part of your storytelling. So again, it was sad. I kind of went through the emotions of the site shutting down as I knew it 2 years ago. And that was, difficult to kind of go through. And so all that kind of came back and washed over me again this past week, just because, again, in journalism, as we kind of go through these different sites, they tend to come back up in maybe zombie forms of themselves. And I'm sure it's not even maybe the last that we'll see of the 538 brand. Disney still owns that. So you kind of have to go through the process of grieving for these things multiple times over the years. But this one was certainly more final than the other ones. And so just wanted to pour one out for the late, great 538.
Neil, I appreciate that. And I want to add one thing, which is that I think a lot of people think that 538 is one thing, and they hear data journalism, they think numbers, they think nerds, they get an idea that 538 was all about analyzing the news one way or the sports world one way. And I think what that misses, and what I think was important to point out, is that just because you all really like to live in numbers does not mean that you thought numbers were the only important things to use to process or to appreciate a sport. In fact, quite the opposite. I have worked at very few places that have been so committed to having fun with the fun stuff in sports as 538. I remember the first thing that I ever worked on with you there was developing a metric that sought to quantify which home runs in baseball history had been the most flagrant violation of the unwritten rule not to swing at 3-0 pitches, which tends to get hitters thrown at or thrown under the bus by their managers if they play for Tony La Russa. And it was that kind of spirit that I really appreciated about 538. I mean, of course, there were a lot of really good quants there who understood how to use numbers to crunch what really mattered to underlying performance in sports and in politics, for that matter. All of that's true. But by no means was that the only club in the bag for the staff at 538, and I always really appreciated that about the way that you all worked.
Well, Alex, do you remember what was the acronym that we used for that metric?
I do. We developed DISS, D-I-S-S, the Derision Index for Superfluous Slams. It was simply inappropriate to swing at a 3-0 pitch, especially if it was late in a blowout and a position player was pitching. And so some of the most disrespectful home runs in baseball history came in exactly that circumstance.
Yeah, when I was there, I did a definitive guide to baseball's pizza discounts, very important work, which was analyzing the local Papa John's offers that would be activated if a team hit a home run and what the probabilities of each was and your return on pizza investment. So yeah, it was serious, but also sometimes the opposite of that. And I know that probably a lot of people associate 538 with politics for good reason, but the sports coverage was incredible in large part thanks to you, Neil, and just so many great writers and so much research and so many stories that I still cite and that I hope will remain online for posterity. And 538 gave me a temporary home after the demise of Grantland because no wonderful website can last forever. So I was grateful to have a home. And there were two things I had to get used to when I started there. One was that there were word counts, kind of, which was not really a priority at Grantland, for better or worse. And then also you mentioned the fact checking. We had fact checking at Grantland as we do at The Ringer, which is great, but it was statistically at least a little less rigorous because, you know, more liberal arts oriented websites perhaps. And so I'm the stat head at The Ringer as I was at Grantland, and at 538 I was outclassed by many people in that respect. And so now it's like, if I have a bunch of stats in an article and I send a big spreadsheet, it's like, well, Ben probably knows what he's talking about. He sent this huge spreadsheet. But at 538, it was much more interrogating each claim and checking each data and decimal point. And I appreciated that rigor. They were really committed to getting things right. And as you said, data is just assumed now when you say journalism, that there will be some data component. And 538 also played a really important part when it came to just maintaining models and data. And some of that you've continued at your Substack and some Nate has at his place, but it's hard to find a clearinghouse for all of the different projections and records of everything that 538 maintained, which was just really an invaluable resource. So subscribe to Neil's Substack, folks. It's the spiritual successor. It's the next best thing to having 538 or having him on your podcast.
And I'm the lone one here who was never published on 538, and I am, as listeners know, the opposite of a stats head. But I always loved the site because, as Alex said, it really didn't. You didn't have to be a stats head to love it. It was just another form of storytelling. And it really did a great job of making kind of data nerd stuff really accessible because it packaged it as storytelling, which is how statistics should be used. And also it gave a home to a lot of great women's sports reporting over the years. And during a time when women's sports was starting to flourish, gave it that, showed like, look, numbers and data nerd stuff is applicable to storytelling in women's sports too. And so thanks for that, Neil. I always loved that.
Well, of course, yeah. I was really proud of the fact that we had a WNBA projection or forecast system before I feel like anybody else really in the mainstream did. And so that's, again, spiritual successor, whatever you want to call my Substack. I maintain that. I also have different WNBA player ratings that I think you can't find anywhere else for the most part as well. So I'm excited to fire those up also.
Thank you so much, Neil, for joining us, for your years of service to a good website. That's all for this episode. We also have a special bonus show that is in the podcast feeds right now for our Slate Plus subscribers. It's about a big debut in the NASCAR Cup series, and it features yet more with Neil Paine, who will be back with us there when you go over Slate Plus subscribers do to your feeds. To hear it, you can subscribe to Slate Plus on Apple Podcasts by clicking Try Free at the top of our show page, or visit slate.com/hangupplus to get access wherever you listen. The episode is available right now, and we will see you over there. Our show notes are at slate.com/hangup. You can email us at hangup@slate.com, and don't forget to follow the show and rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. Our producer is Kevin Bendis. For Ben Lindbergh and Lindsay Gibbs with Neil Paine this week, I'm Alex Kirshner. Remember Zelma Beatty, and thanks for listening.
For a limited time at Verizon, you can get our best price ever for a single line. Just $45 per month when you bring your phone, which is less than you spend on Too Tired to Cook takeout every week. Get one line on unlimited welcome for $45 per month with AutoPay plus taxes and fees. Visit your local Verizon store by April 2nd to save. $20 monthly promo credits applied over 36 months with a new line on unlimited welcome. In times of congestion, unlimited 5G and 4G LTE may be temporarily slower than other traffic. Domestic data roaming at 2G speeds. Additional terms apply.